The story begins with the heroine realizing that she had retained memories from her past life only when she felt an unbearable headache and started crying. She was surprised by the way she cried. It helped her to dive into the past. It was the baby's crying that awakened her memories, from which we learned that in a previous life she was a kindergarten teacher, and being a penniless orphan, she had to work overtime, which led to her stupid death from exhaustion. Now the protagonist, who did not believe her happiness at first, realized that the family she was born into was quite wealthy. Her father was an earl with a huge fortune, and her mother was a recognized beauty. Now she had an ideal life and family. However, after looking at the portrait of the family, the girl had to admit one problem. She was reborn in the world of the novel she knew, but here she was not the protagonist, but the villain. Although without her role, the novel would have been rather boring. Now she was an adorable little girl named Ibeline Monster, and as she decided to think about her character's fate, the heroine remembered that in the story, the protagonist and heroine are supposed to fall in love with each other, which means that someone has to bring them together as children, and she is supposed to fall in love with the protagonist and start envying the heroine. After imagining her future life, the girl realized that after hating the main character, she would have to start bullying her, and then the hero would come back years later and punish the villain for everything. Shrinking from the realization of the criticality of the situation, the heroine noted that it is fun to read the novel, but to live in it and be a villain, not so much, and remembered that if you follow the plot, the protagonist will take everything from her family, and they will become fallen nobles, and in the end, from grief, will have to compromise pride and give up the title of countess. Suddenly, the girl screamed, clutching her head as she realized that after the appearance of the main character, her cozy home, delicious food, and toys would come to an end. It wasn't fair, so she wasn't happy with her new situation. The beleaguered heroine, who didn't want to lose everything she has now, suddenly brightened with delight when she came up with a great idea. She would simply not fall in love with the protagonist and wouldn't bother the heroine, thus continuing to enjoy her life in peace. Thinking about what she would spend her whole life on, the protagonist, who was walking down the hall, noticed her mother reading a book and rushed to her, hugging her tightly, and the latter, looking at the little girl with the tenderness of a mother, warned the girl that next week they were expecting guests. Ibeline, whose face was still glowing with a smile stretched across it, inquired who they were expecting to visit, to which her mother replied that they would be visited by the child of a very good man whom she had known before her marriage. His son was a very sickly boy, so was going to come to improve his health. The heroine, who at the same moment guessed that it was about the main character of the novel, asked his name, and the mother, noticing the frightened expression on her daughter's face, became agitated, but answered, Cassius Ren Uriko, which confirmed the girl's guess. Soon the boy did arrive, but for now the heroine, who decided to take a break from playing hide-and-seek with her friends and just observe, thought she already knew what was going to happen in the future, and decided it would be easier for her to change it in her favor. But she still felt some uncertainty for some reason. She looked like a child now, so she tended to play a lot. But during such childishness, she had been shamed and decided that she needed to rest for a while. And it didn't matter to her now that she remembered her past life, for things could have turned out differently and she would have been an ordinary child. From the disturbing thoughts of the heroine, was distracted by the voice of a girl who immediately pounced on her, and the boy, also approaching them, told the one that it was unfair and she should not sit next to those caught during the game. But the fidgeter, who was already hugging her friend, apologized to her partner in the game and said that she needed a little breathing room. Noticing that the girl had run over and was now breathing heavily, the protagonist carefully offered her a handkerchief, and the radiant little girl, whose name was Eliza Stim, and who was the protagonist of the novel, called her a soul and smiled sincerely. From the heroine's flashbacks to the novel, we learn that although their estates are not far from each other, Eliza's family is not of high status, and her father works for the Earl of Monster. Yet they have grown close over the years. But in the original story, the villainess despised her friend and was not shy about lording it over her as if she were a servant. Taking another look at her friend and remembering her plan, the protagonist hugged the sweet girl, comparing her to a sweet bun, and decided that she was completely different and would never hurt her. After that, the little girl asked her friend for permission to come to play with her tomorrow and said that she wanted to make her favorite cookies, but the latter, apologizing, refused her and explained that tomorrow a guest from the capital will arrive to them with whom she will immediately introduce the girl as soon as she has the opportunity. Eliza lowered her head disappointedly and sighed, saying that the guest must be very happy to be living with Abby, and she looked fondly at her companion and noticed that she was jealous, but did not condemn her. Such behavior was quite common for children of her age. Taking her peer by the hand, the heroine told her that she should not worry, because the guest's arrival would not affect their relationship. She was still her best friend, and more dear to her than any other friend in the world. Hearing this, the latter, barely holding back tears of emotion, rushed to hug her friend, whom she also considered her best friend. At this time, the protagonist thought that getting close to the protagonist of the novel was a bad idea, as he would sow a seed of discord between her and Eliza. But becoming Eliza's friend was a better solution. Now her next move was to set up her friend and Cassius, who soon arrived at her estate. A while later, the annoyed heroine had to admit that no matter how hard she tried to deny everything, that moment had come. Her mother, seeing her daughter's confusion, asked if she was all right, to which she replied that she was just very excited, and her mother thought that her daughter was so jubilant because now she would have a lot of new friends. But it was not so easy to understand the girl's emotions. Suddenly, everyone ran out onto the porch as the sound of an approaching carriage was heard in the distance. The protagonist was speechless and froze on the spot, eyes wide open as she saw the shining blue eyes on the snow-white face, the tender, lily-like lips of the arrival. The guest approached and greeted the heroine politely, putting his hand to his chest and bowing as a sign of respect. He was fabulously handsome, but despite her secret admiration, the girl suddenly lost her temper and irritably pounced on her mother with questions about whether it was really Cassius and why he seemed so grown up. Meanwhile, the guy kept his eyes on the new acquaintance, which confused her. She didn't understand why he was studying her so carefully. Then the guy couldn't stand it and approached the woman with a question whether the girl was her daughter, to which the mother nodded affirmatively and confirmed it, inviting the girl to come up to them and say hello to the guest. The heroine at the same moment ran up and with a happy smile extended her hand to her friend, introducing herself as Ibelina and saying that she was very glad to meet him, to which the boy, smiling in return, reciprocated the girl. His mother, glad at the boy's arrival, cheered him up and noticed that the children here were growing by leaps and bounds, and assuming that he was tired from the road, offered him a rest, putting him in one of the far rooms of the castle, which had been planned and arranged in advance, not without the help of her daughter, who wanted to have as little contact with him as possible. Lurking behind a pillar in the far corner of the corridor, Abby tried to see if she could see the guy from this spot, and thought wryly that she had planned it right, because if she wanted to get the upper hand on her enemy, she had to know his weaknesses first. Suddenly, she felt someone touch her shoulder and cried out in surprise and fright, turning around and noticing it was the guy's escort, Paul, who immediately recoiled from her, apologizing for scaring her. He actually wanted to help. The heroine, trying to come up with an excuse for why she was watching the guy's room from the far end of the corridor, said that it was nothing and she wasn't scared, but she just really wanted to play hide and seek, but she didn't know who to play with. The attendant believed what he said, got excited and offered to play with her, and the girl had no choice but to agree. Otherwise, he could definitely suspect something. She ordered Paul to drive and decided to hide herself, and the guy agreed, starting to count the count, and the heroine exhaled with relief and reassurance that she had gotten something out of the situation. It was just a game, but the heroine was not going to give up, because the game was in her house, and she knew it like the back of her hand, and immediately decided that the library is the most ideal place for hiding. So she decided to hide there. Diochka ran into the library and, hiding behind a corner, froze and waited, when suddenly she heard some strange sound inside the room. Looking out from the corner, she saw Cassius standing at the other end of the room, holding a book taken from the shelf. The heroine was confused, racking her brains and not understanding what he had forgotten here and what she should do now that he was here. Apparently, she needed to hide. She knelt down so that he wouldn't notice her and began to crawl quietly behind the closet as she suddenly heard her being called out. Turning around, she saw a guy standing behind her, asking in amazement why she was crawling around, to which she was completely confused and couldn't think of anything to say in response. At the same moment, Paul's voice came from behind the library door, who had been looking for her everywhere for a long time, and was now shouting that she was very good at hiding, and it was very difficult to find her in this house. The little girl grabbed Cassius's arm in a panic and tore behind the bookcase. The boy, in utter bewilderment, began to resent what she was doing, to which the girl, so engrossed in the game, hissed at him to shut up or Paul would find her, especially as his voice came closer and closer to them and threatened to find her. The fellow playing hide-and-seek with the girl thought he heard some sound, but after stopping and listening, he saw nothing and went to look further. The girl exhaled and realized that she was lucky, and the guy, not finding her, went to look further. But now her heart was pounding like crazy, trying to jump out of her chest. Soon she came to her senses, and was horrified to find that all this time she had been sitting with her arms around the guy. The guy, too, was utterly bewildered by what had happened, and waking up, asked her to put him down, whereupon they flashed away from each other like sworn enemies. The girl recoiled away from the guy, trying to realize how this could have happened to her, and realized that this cute face could give her a heart attack. Trying to justify her rash act to the guy, who groaned in the corner of the room in pain, the girl only whispered inarticulately that the whole mess was due to a game of hide-and-seek. The guy was hurt, and the girl, with eyes full of tears, started to apologize to him, assuring him that she didn't mean to hurt him. But what was her surprise when the guy angrily shouted that everything pissed him off and he hated children. He gave her a stern look and decided to remind her that the library was for reading books, not playing hide-and-seek, which finally discouraged Abby, because she couldn't believe that he was reprimanding her. Suddenly, Paul appeared in the doorway and exclaimed joyfully, having found the little girl at last. But at the same moment, his face became frightened and surprised. For Cassius was standing behind the girl. The attendant had a question as to what he was doing here. To the girl's utter amazement, the fellow at the same moment changed his face and gallantly bent down to her, giving her his hand and offering to help her up, after which he sympathized with the fact that she was all dirty and advised her to be more careful, even shaking off a speck of dust from her face. He politely said goodbye and left, wishing them a good time and to be more careful from now on, leaving his new acquaintance in complete bewilderment. She remained standing there confused, not understanding how he could do that to her. No matter how much the heroine thought about what was going on, it seemed to her that Cassius hated her and always looked down on her. But she couldn't understand the reason for this attitude towards herself, and wasn't ready to believe that everything was just because she was a villain in the original. She was distracted from her thoughts by the voice of her friend, with whom she was now sitting in the gazebo drinking tea. She asked her excitedly why she looked so worried and cloudy, and asked her to tell her if anything was wrong. Aibileen brushed it off, saying she was just thinking about it for a bit, but caught off guard by her friend's request to talk about what was bothering her so much. She asked her if she had ever had one of those times where she was hated for no reason. Realizing that something had happened, Eliza, horrified by what she had heard, asked her friend who was bothering her, and immediately guessed that it was the boy who had come from the capital. Realizing that she had said too much, the heroine blushed, waved her hands, and, trying to tell her interlocutor that she didn't mean it at all, hurriedly changed the subject, suggesting to start with the cake and noting its excellent taste. Looking at her reflection in the tea, the protagonist exhaled a sigh of relief. She had almost inadvertently destroyed the relationship between the protagonists. Now there was no trace of the villain, so she should be more careful. Since that day, she had worried about what her guest thought of her and had tried to find out more about him. Watching him from the outside, she noted that he appeared most often in the library and in the garden, and that he seemed to spend his days within the walls of the manor, reading books or walking in the garden. Turning back to her memories of the novel again, the heroine noticed that it wasn't like that in the novel, and he behaved differently. But suddenly she grabbed her head again. Every time she remembered her past life, her head started to split. In fact, she hardly knew the events of the original novel, and memories from her past life came back to her in infancy, so she didn't have time to write anything down. But the important details were sure to stick in her mind. As the protagonist stepped out into the garden, she saw her mother, who was now drinking tea and eating cake, and ran to her, waving her arms. Noticing her daughter, the woman invited her to join her tea party. The girl exclaimed enthusiastically and started eating her dessert, when suddenly her mother asked her if she was friends with Cassius, whereupon the little girl fell silent and distracted herself from eating. She didn't want to disappoint her mother. Noticing her daughter's confusion, the kind mother turned to her and told her that the boy had actually come here to heal his mental wounds, and, despite his poor health, he was suffering not only on the outside, but also on the inside. When the body weakens, so does the soul. We learn that the ailment from which Cassius suffered is called mana hypersensitivity and manifests itself in the fact that the patient's body continuously absorbs mana, and his body can no longer cope with the disease, so that for Cassius, it is like a double-edged sword, and if he does not tame the mana flows, he will die in unbearable agony. Turning again to her daughter, the woman said that she should become a friend of the sick man, as it would make him happy, and noticing that the little companion had finished her piece of cake, she sent her to the boy's room, handing to the maid who was to escort the little girl a piece of cake for her daughter's friend as well. Entering the sick man's room, the heroine waved her hand in greeting, and the maid handed the boy a piece of cake from her mistress and left, making Abby nervous. Delighted with the treat, Cassius suggested to the girl that they have a tea party together. The door slammed shut, and the guest sitting opposite the protagonist looked indifferently in the other direction when the girl offered him a taste of the cake, but he rudely refused without looking at her. Cassius's behavior seemed strange to the heroine. As soon as an adult loomed before his eyes, he turned into a boyish boy. Even now, before the maid left, he was charming. Noting the boy's indifference, the girl said that she would eat it all herself, and the boy, casting a surprised look at her, did not believe that she would not persuade him to eat with her. Angry at this reaction, the little girl said that she was not hired to babysit him, but realizing that she had overdone it, embarrassedly offered him a piece of dessert. At last Cassius tasted the treat, which he liked, but he never lost his cool. Deciding to take care of him some more, the heroine handed him a mug of milk and told him to drink what he had eaten so he wouldn't choke on it. But he snatched the drink, and before he could hear Abby's warning, he burned himself with the hot milk, which made her laugh. Finally, the heroine's father came home, and she, hearing his joyful exclamation, jumped on him and began to hug him, then asked how he was doing at work, and said that she missed him very much, jabbing at his beard. After some time, it was decided to organize a family dinner, to which the guest was also invited, who immediately thanked the heroine's returning father for the care he had received from his family. Glancing at the other members of their modest banquet, the boy was surprised to note that the family he was now sitting with had a very warm atmosphere. The father was coaxing his daughter to eat, and the mother was wiping the soiled girl. Taking his eyes off the little girl, the father suggested a reception to celebrate Cassius's arrival, to welcome him properly and introduce him to the neighbors. But at these words, the boy turned pale at hearing that he would have to make friends with his peers, but quickly pushing the confusion away, thanked the family once again for their hospitality. The heroine, who had been watching the guest all this time, was confused to notice that it was worth mentioning the reception, and he didn't eat another spoonful, and wondered if he didn't like such events. However, despite the boy's torment, there came a solemn day of reception, with which the protagonist responsibly prepared. Now she looked very elegant and neat. Monster is a vast land that is located far away from the capital, which in addition has become a favorite place for recreation of the aristocracy. So today they were visited by many nobles, and even Cassius came. but he clearly felt out of place among the adults. Noticing the boy's confusion, the heroine approached him and, grabbing his hand, turned to his father, asking permission to introduce their guest to his friends. The latter approved her idea and, leaning over to the child, said that he must not be easy among adults and he really should communicate with his peers. Abby led her friend away, telling him on the way that the children usually spent such evenings in a separate room rather than in the main hall. But as soon as they left the main room, the companion snatched his hand away and, looking at the Count's daughter unhappily, asked where she got the bad habit of grabbing other people. Noting again that the boy reacts violently every time she touches him, the heroine suggested that he has a fear of touching people around him and apologized, confessing guiltily that she had not noticed such behavior before, but now she did it accidentally and hopes that he will forgive her. Noticing that the guy got excited, and from this his ears turned red, the protagonist did not try to keep her thoughts to herself and directly informed him about it, then very embarrassed him. Deciding to be more attentive to Cassius, the girl grabbed him, now not by the arm, but by the sleeve, and led him into the room where the other children were already waiting for them, who were very happy about the guest's arrival, and admitted that they had been waiting for him for a long time. Stepping aside, the heroine noticed that all the guests gathered here today were their neighbors, who, unlike the capital's gatherings, would not judge anyone for their status. But suddenly, noticing the girl with the fan, Luna Vanessa, who stood at a distance from everyone, mentally called her a grebe, which is just as likely to humiliate on the status. The girl recognized her at once, for she, being the daughter of the Marquis, was good friends with Ibeline from the novel, but now the heroine, on the contrary, did not become close to her. For since the character of Luna and her friends left much to be desired, she feared to harm Eliza by falling under their bad influence. When she approached a lonely acquaintance, the protagonist indifferently asked her what brought her here, and the latter, waving away and putting on an insincere smile, said that she just missed her, and then, noticing Cassius, approached him and tried to make conversation. Noticing that Cassius treated her opponent better than she did, the girl, barely holding back tears of indignation, tried again to understand why, when she spoke to him, he immediately began to be rude, and why he didn't like her, when with the others, he was as smooth as silk. Luna noticed that the boy was answering her questions with interest and, not wanting to interrupt the conversation, exclaimed that she had seen him last year at the Crown Prince's birthday party, but the one that it was not so, and after the girl continued to insist on her own, looking at her coldly and repeating what she had said earlier, turned around and walked away. Realizing that the boy has left, the presumptuous girl runs away in tears. He has broken her heart, and the heroine, suddenly turning around at a strange noise, sees Eliza, and then throws a glance at Cassius and freezes, realizing that this is a fateful meeting of the two heroes. Rushing over to her friend, Eliza enthusiastically grabbed her hand, saying that she had barely found it. The girls had agreed to meet in this room, but the other wanted to meet her friend, afraid that she would get bored without her. Turning again to the memories of the novella, the heroine realizes that although this is the first meeting between Cassius, who attracts other people's gazes, and Eliza, who shines like the sun, the fire of love will be kindled between them, and she is obliged to become their bond. When she brought her friend to Cassius, the girl introduced her companion, but when she saw the boy, she shouted that he was ugly, which shocked the heroine. But she guessed that she was treating the guest like that because of her friend's words about someone hating her for no reason. Cassius, who had no idea what was going on, remained calm and did not answer, and at the same time the heroine, burning with shame, whispered to the angry Elise that she had said that without thinking, and she should stop acting like that. But the latter exclaimed that she had never seen her so glum. Now Ibeline was panicking. The meeting of the main characters had turned into a nightmare, and, if it went on like this, she would end up like in the novel. But her thoughts were interrupted by a boy who finally spoke and asked the other girl if her friend had told her that he hated her. Throwing a look of hatred at him, she shouted that it was her friend who was really very sad, because he hated her for no reason. The heroine tried to interrupt her friend by saying that everything was not as she thought it was, when suddenly she was approached by a boy who, smiling, said that he did not hate her at all. After these words, Eliza, who seemed to have forgotten that she had just almost razed her friend's abuser to the ground, smiled enthusiastically and said that it was impossible to hate Abeline's sweet bun, much to her embarrassment and comfort. Holding out his hand in apology and admitting that he hadn't realized he had hurt her feelings, Cassius promised to behave more carefully from now on, and the girl, shaking his hand, worriedly realized that she had set the protagonist on her heels with her actions. Sometime later, the heroine was sitting in the gazebo, looking tiredly at the black egg standing right in front of her, when she suddenly complained to Bean, that was the name of the dragon egg her father had brought her from a business trip, that she had received 5 errands from Cassius today alone. After receiving an egg as a gift from her father, the girl was delighted and started asking her dad about it, but he only replied that he didn't know when it would hatch, but if she took care of it, one day it would definitely happen. Upon hearing this story, Eliza sarcastically noted the originality of the name of the little girl's new friend. And though this reaction alarmed the mistress, she could think of nothing better. Turning to Bean again, the heroine said that after the reception in honor of his arrival, Cassius began to abuse her. He asked her to fetch water, although he could turn to the servants, and in private he tyrannized her. But in front of adults, he built himself an angel, finishing with the fact that even if she tried to expose him, no one would believe her. The protagonist, clenching her fists with anger, asked Bean, as soon as she hatched, to bite that annoying boy good. Then she could not think what consequences awaited her. Sometime later, at the request of Cassius, who declared that the flowers in his vase had wilted, and at the sight of them he thought of his approaching death, she went to gather lilacs. Now the heroine felt an overwhelming sense of hatred for him, but she realized that now he is just a child, who is destined to fall in love with Eliza, and then return to the capital, and whatever he did now, in a year they will be parted forever, so she has not so long to hold out. Seeing that the poor girl had brought him flowers at his request, Cassius, smiling guiltily, apologized and said that he had actually wanted a bouquet of lavender instead of lilacs, but had mixed them up because they were the same color. The heroine, who was not at all surprised by such a statement, wished the boy a good rest and left his room, slamming the door loudly. She was not going to collect anything for him. From the memories of the heroine, we learn that in her previous life, she was a kindergarten teacher, and even though those times are far behind her, it was still easy for her to manage a child. The cheeky boy has been doing nothing but giving the protagonist orders the whole time. But one time when she sneered in response to his request, the boy was afraid that she wouldn't fulfill his wishes. Touching the forehead of the embarrassed guest, the anxious heroine noticed that he was feverish and suggested that he had caught cold because the window in his room was open. The maid, who had come up at that moment, noticing that the guest was not feeling well, hastened to fetch a cup of hot milk at the girl's request. Looking at the worried boy who didn't like milk, the girl shouted to the maid to bring a cup of black tea instead, and marveled that the sick man could drink such a bitter beverage, adding that he was just like an adult, to which the maid immediately agreed. It turns out that the heroine has not been sitting idle all this time. Watching Cassius, she studied him thoroughly and learned that he hates black tea, so she decided to do him a favor by asking the maid to make him tea. After getting his drink and deciding to pretend that nothing embarrassed him, the boy forcefully forced himself to take a sip, but, wrinkling his nose in disgust, pretended that everything was fine, and the girl, noticing his sincere reaction, which he tried so hard to hide, showed him her tongue. The next day, the little girl, walking down the palace corridor, was thinking about how she could prank an acquaintance today, when suddenly she saw him, rushed to him and asked him how she could help this time. The boy, surprised by such actions of the girl, sadly asked her to stop treating him like that, which surprised the girl, because it was not usual for him to remove the mask of indifference, and he did not look very good today. Noticing Cassius's strange reaction, the heroine immediately stopped smiling and mocked him, asking if he was hurt. But he brushed her hand away, turned and walked away, angrily shouting goodbye not to bother him again. The girl, taken aback by this reaction, tried to understand where he got such aggression from, that he brushed her off as soon as she touched him, and decided that it looked like he really had a fever and she shouldn't leave now, because there was no telling what could happen to him. The heroine stretched out her hand after the familiar and stood up as if she had tried to stop him, seeing that the boy had fallen to the floor right in front of her. Sitting in front of his bed, the protagonist covered her face with her hands and began to blame herself for making the sick child worse. But the doctor said that Cassius had passed out due to an overabundance of mana, and if he had taken his medication on time, this wouldn't have happened. She remembered that Paul had said that Cassius drank pills every day, and she guessed that if the medicine didn't have the desired effect, then the patient probably didn't take them on purpose. She had met such children when she worked in a kindergarten. Remembering the peculiarities of the behavior of children who refused to drink the medicine, the girl thought that, if her assumption is correct, then the pills must be somewhere near, and, opening a small hidden box, found in it the cherished medicine. Remembering that Cassius hated anything bitter, she assumed that he had started spitting out the medicine because it was too bitter. And with a chagrined sigh, the girl decided to wait until he woke up and question him about everything, because the boy could get in trouble if she told the adults. Noticing that the sick man's face took a worried expression, the girl thought that he was in pain, but suddenly he grabbed her hand, calling her mom, and began to cry. In delirium, he burst into tears and began to apologize to Mom, which was actually Abby. The girl, who didn't understand what was going on, looked puzzled at the boy who called her Mama and realized that he had confused the two because of the fever. Realizing that he needed help now, the heroine decided to play along and stroked his head, affectionately telling him that she would never leave him, asking him to rest and get well soon. Keeping an eye on the patient, the protagonist realized that he missed his mother very much. After all, he is only a child, so it's not easy for him to live away from his parents. Thinking about the boy's parents, the protagonist remembered that in the novel, Cassius was separated from his family as a child, but the Duke and Duchess never appeared in the novel, and when the matured protagonist came to get Eliza, he was already a duke, so his father had died by that time. After these thoughts, the heroine's head again pierced a sharp pain. Leaning on the guy's bed, the girl took another look at him. When he was sleeping, he looked like a real angel, so the heroine realized that she had been too harsh with him because he was just a child trying to seem grown up, and promised not to tease him anymore. Cassius woke up in the night, and looking out the window, at first he did not understand what had happened, and noticed that he had not slept so soundly for a long time, and that the heaviness in his body had disappeared. It was probably the doctor's merit, which meant that his father knew about everything, because he had sent the doctor here. Finally, the boy decided he should be more careful as he suddenly opened his eyes wide with surprise, noticing Aibileen sleeping by his bedside, who was now holding his hand. From Cassius's reflections, we learn that he was impressed by their first meeting, and now he will never forget it, because then he noticed the love of the mother and the girl, and remembered that his mother had never treated him with warmth, and having failed to live up to her expectations, he was exiled to this place. Thinking about his parents, he realized that they wouldn't even cry if he died here, so he decided not to take any more medication and thought he was skillfully hiding his pain. But looking at the girl, he wondered how the girl had guessed everything. Looking once more at the sweetly sleeping babe, the guy, deciding not to wake her up after all, apologized to her for being so stubborn. But once again, he wondered how he would be able to keep from teasing her, since his hands itched as soon as he looked at her, and her reaction made him laugh. In fact, as they played, he wished he had lived a little longer, so he decided to apologize to the girl next time. When she woke up, the heroine stretched, noticing that she hadn't slept at all, and looked out at Cassius, who she thought was still asleep. But as soon as she touched his cheek, he immediately opened his eyes and irritatedly asked what she was doing. The boy startled her with his abrupt awakening, and the protagonist recoiled from him, shrinking back in fear, and noticing that he was angry, hurriedly explained that he hadn't woken up, so she thought he was dead. Cassius ordered her to leave, but the girl, frowning, did not follow his order, and asked why he did not take his medicine. Pretending not to know what she was talking about, The protagonist of the novel anxiously declared that Paul prepared them for him every day, but the acquaintance, who had already guessed everything, said that he should not lie, for she had found his pills under his bed. Noticing that the guy was not going to confess, the heroine sighed tiredly and hurried to calm him down, saying that she could understand him because the medicine is really bitter and he must be disgusted to drink it. But the more bitter the medicine, the more it helps. She said this because she did not want the guest to get worse, otherwise all the lumps would fall on her family. The disappointed little girl asked the guy if he really hated them that much, and the guy, choosing not to reveal his real motives, confirmed it. After that, the heroine asked from the idea that visited her. She offered the boy a compromise, which was that if he would take his medication faithfully, she would start bringing him goodies, but he refused at first. However, when the girl threatened Cassius that she would take Cliff the pills he had hidden under his bed if he refused, he said that she was doing purely out of self-interest because she hated him, and he was causing her nothing but trouble. But the girl, without refuting this, said that she just didn't want him to feel bad. Glancing at the boy, who pursed his lips in resentment, she told him that he was obliged to take the medicine, however bitter it might be, because if he misbehaved, he would faint again and make everyone worry. Having listened carefully to the heroine, the boy, saddened by the loss of his head, said that it was not a fact that he would get better, even taking them, and the girl, hearing this, guessed that all this time he was only pretending to be an adult, and in fact he was scared and afraid that something would go wrong. The protagonist, mortified by the weakness of the boy who had previously seemed invulnerable to her, smiled. She knew he would survive, since he was the main character of the novel, and said that he would probably feel better soon. Noticing the resentment of the boy, who did not share her enthusiasm, the heroine touched his hair and said that he was still a child, and children recover very quickly, so he would soon get better. Hearing this, the hero frowned and snorted, saying it was nonsense. Not wanting to talk to the annoying girl any longer, he turned away, saying he had not expected more from her, and ordered her to leave, since she had made sure he was all right. This angered the heroine, who exclaimed that he could at least thank her. After that, Cassius, who had been hiding his true feelings all this time, never looked at the caring child, embarrassedly thanked her for taking care of him, much to the surprise of his little companion. As she left the room and looked away, the girl thought, the sick man really didn't know how to say thank you, but it wasn't so bad, because he at least tried, and apparently he did it sincerely. From that day on, the heroine started making sure Cassius took his medication, and luckily he was no longer sneaking around getting cookies from his girlfriend for it. So soon, he was really on the mend. The improvement of the guest's condition, of course, pleased the protagonist, but she faced one serious problem, which she had completely forgotten about. Cassius and Eliza did not get the slightest bit closer to each other. The very title of the novel, First Love, said that the hero should have fallen in love at first sight. But now the guy was not interested in her friend at all, and even their first meeting did not look like a fateful acquaintance of the protagonist's. And all because they were absolutely not interested in each other. Remembering how her friend attacked the guest, the protagonist clutched her head in horror and realized that her main enemy was her own tongue, after which she exclaimed irritably again that she couldn't go on like this. She had to bring the heroes together for the sake of her own happiness. For days, she'd been desperate to bring the couple together. She'd arranged a special tea party for them, dragged Cassius out for walks so she and Elise could get to know each other better. She'd done everything she could. She was now riding with her mother in the carriage and thinking that, in spite of her efforts, all attempts to bring the characters together were useless, when suddenly her mother diverted her from her reflections by announcing that they had arrived at the convent. We learn that this weekend, the heroine's family was invited to the convent thanks to the generous donations of her father, and the girl just always wanted to visit this place, as it was famous and was not very far from the estate. Inside, the church was huge, which is why it was compared to a palace, and the impressed little girl noted the power and richness of the church, noting afterward that she did not feel particularly comfortable here. Finally, her anxious thoughts were interrupted by one of the 3 priests who came out to them, thanking the family for the journey and for arriving so early. The man's greeting was warm, so the girl guessed that the father had given them quite a bit of money. The speaker then stated that Mr. Aha had asked him to tell them that he would be a little late, so they should wait for him. And glancing at Cassius, who was now also here, recognized that this was the same sick child he had heard about. At last they were allowed to enter, and the heroine's father, noticing that the boy was agitated, asked if he felt ill, but the boy, greatly embarrassed, said that he felt fine, but was just worried, that he had already caused his family a lot of trouble, and now he had come here with them and was wasted their time. Clenching his fists, the head of the family trembled, but took a deep breath and stroked the guest's head, saying that from the moment he entered their home, he had already become a member of their family, and when a child is sick, it is the parent's duty to take care of him, so he cannot become a burden to them. The father then turned to his wife and said he would go away, but the latter, not deigning to wait in the guest room, said she would like to pray while she had time, and invited her daughter to come up with her. Now the girls were standing in a special room and folding their hands at their breasts, praying as the little girl noted her mother's beauty. But suddenly, someone entered the room, which drew her away from her musings. Noticing that they were now being watched by a boy wearing a priest's robe, the heroine was surprised that her peer was already serving in the church, but kept her eyes on him. At last her mother finished praying and, smiling affectionately, asked her daughter what had happened, her face expressing anxiety. Abby, noticing that she had alarmed her mother, told her that someone was looking in their direction and wanted to point at the watcher. But when she turned to the direction where he was standing, she realized that there was no one there. Her mother calmed her down, saying that she had just imagined it, and suggested that she go to dinner. She was sure that she had seen the boy, who was watching the guests, but she decided not to argue with her mother so as not to alarm her. All the guests were assembled at a sumptuous table, and the priest, supposing them all very tired from the journey, invited them to enjoy their dinner. The girl was amazed at the richness of the table, for such a meal could certainly not be called modest. How much the parents had donated to the church if they made such a fuss. She was very concerned about how Cassius felt after the priest had prayed for him, whether he was better. But the boy sadly replied that he hadn't noticed any change yet, and getting angry with her, asked her to move away from him at last. The girl moved away, annoyed, not understanding how she could be secretive with him then, and how he could be displeased when she worried about him. The priest switched to Abby, admiring how grown-up she was already, to which the parents were surprised that he remembered their daughter, though of course he did, for he had baptized her once. The priest remembered the heroine, for he had seldom met children who were so at ease in holy water, and this young lady was one of them. Her mother doubted if the girl remembered anything about it, for she was quite a babe when she was brought here. The parents remembered that day very well, because an incredible thing happened when the girl was dipped in the font. For a second she stopped breathing, and even seemed to fall into a deep sleep. In the memory of the priest, it was the first child that fell asleep during the baptism. Daddy was very touched by these memories, admitting that then sobbed in 3 streams of happiness. What a wonderful day it was, and now the daughter has become so big. The girl touchingly replied to her parents that it was all thanks to them. A drop of holy water is able to keep any person from defilement, but babies are so pure that it is of no use. But if those adults in whose souls dwells rottenness touch holy water, they may perish. So it is not surprising that they were surprised by a child who fell asleep in the font. The mother once again thanked the priest sincerely, saying that her daughter had grown up healthy thanks to him, to which he invited them to visit them more often, because thanks to their family this place would prosper. The girl grinned to herself, thinking that the main thing was not to forget to take with them thick purses. And then the main character asked the priest if they had any priests of her age, to which the priest, after a bit of thought, said that there were a couple of students of her age. He invited one young man, and he introduced himself as being in charge of training future priests, and said that if he could describe what the guy looked like, he could bring him here. The girl was embarrassed because she did not even count on the meeting and hurried to refuse, saying that it was unnecessary. But curiosity did not let her go, and after a short pause, still tormented by curiosity, described the guy that he had blue hair and yellow eyes. The minister stood pensively, not recalling that there had been any such person among his pupils, to which the girl continued to assure him that he wore a priest's robe. The priest, after listening attentively to the heroine, explained to her that many children go to church to pray in cassocks, and apparently she had met one of them. Abby sadly had to accept it. In the meantime, it was getting evening, so the priest suggested that they spend the night at their house tonight and then set out tomorrow, to which Dad gladly agreed, saying it was an excellent suggestion and thanking them for their concern, so they decided to stay the night at the church. According to local rules, men and women had to live separately, so the girl and her mother went to a separate room, which turned out contrary to the expectations of the heroine. Even too large and changed clothes, went to bed, wishing each other sweet dreams. The heroine lay for a long time, tossing and turning, trying to sleep, but could not in any way in the new place, and finally decided to go to get some air. Going out into the yard, she saw a beautiful sculpture of an angel girl with wings, and stood admiringly before it, admiring the beauty and grace. Suddenly she heard a sound in the bushes. She strained her hearing and called out to see if anyone was there, and to her amazement, she saw the very guy in priest's clothes she wanted to know about. The girl recognized him at once, but he jumped out of the bushes and rushed away, which she did not expect, and rushed after him, shouting for him to stop. She ran with all her might, and finally she managed to catch up with him, and falling down, she caught him by the legs. The boy was very frightened, and tearfully began to ask her not to be angry, as he did not want to peep at her. But the girl did not understand why he called her a fairy and what he was apologizing for. Holding out her handkerchief to him, she approached him, affectionately explaining that she did not want to frighten him, but only wanted to just talk to him. After calming down a little, the boy looked at her with his confused and tearful eyes and asked why she wanted to talk to him. At this point, he looked like a little puppy. The girl frowned and explained to him that she had seen him gawking at her in the prayer room. The poor man cried again and started to apologize, but Abby looked at him affectionately and whispered that he could look at her all he wanted and there was no need to apologize. The boy calmed down and raised his beautiful eyes to her and called her a fairy again, which made the girl puzzled as to why he was calling her that again. She didn't consider herself a fairy. He thought so because to him she shone, and even the stars beside her, it seemed to him, shone brighter. But the heroine found him stubborn, and suddenly wondered if he had fallen in love with her. Smiling sweetly at the confused boy, she still explained to him that she was not a fairy, and her name was Aibeline Mostera, and asked him politely what his name was, but he was confused and could not utter a word. The owner of the voice that called out to the boy turned out to be Cassius. He looked very serious, and the boy, seeing him, said he was sorry, and ran away without even saying his name. Cassius turned to the protagonist, indifferently asking if she knew the one, and the girl, with a saddened sigh, said that this was their first meeting, to which the interlocutor mumbled puzzledly, but answered nothing. Placing his hands on the girl's shoulders, much to her surprise, he offered to go back indoors, deciding that the little girl must be cold, after which he irritably asked how one could hang around so mindlessly, to which the girl remarked that he had also gone out at night, saying she should be more careful. He touched her forehead and said she was too kind to strangers and offered to take her to her room, grabbing her sleeve. And the girl remarked that he only cared for her because he was a little older, and it seemed to be becoming a habit of his, as if they had only gotten close yesterday. Now they were walking together, and the heroine, looking at him again, noticed that he seemed cute when his ears were red. Without noticing how it happened, she grabbed his hand, but remembering that he had told her not to touch him, she hurried to yank her hand away, but he grabbed it himself and gave her permission not to let him go if she was afraid. The protagonist was embarrassed because she grabbed his hand not out of fear, but she didn't let him go, and now she couldn't say a word, so she followed him silently. Some time later, a servant came to the heroine and reported that she had received an invitation from Lady Luna Vanessa. Hearing this, the girl was alarmed. She had not expected to receive an invitation from her to a reception at which there would be a guest from the capital. In her invitation, the arrogant girl said she was hosting a party at her mansion in honor of her friend's arrival from the capital, and hoped that she and Cassius would come and have a good time. Her intentions were obvious. She had never given up trying to be friends with Cassius. After reading the letter, the heroine ran to the boy, asking if he had read the invitation. But he immediately stated that he was not going to go anywhere because he hated parties, although in the novel, he sometimes attended receptions. The girl was surprised that his behavior now was different from that of the novel, and she decided to ask him directly why he disliked receptions so much, saying that she had noticed it even during the first reception given by his father. The heroine, on the contrary, was crazy about such events, which surprised her friend, but immediately explained that she has no reason not to like them, because there is always delicious food, good music, and you can have fun with friends. Remembering an incident when a friend of hers had eaten so much that he couldn't get up, she said that receptions were fun, because something interesting always happened there. But her companion was not impressed and said that if it was so interesting, she should go alone, and then irritably sent her away. A short while later, the heroine was already at Luna Manor, but now she was not at all in the mood to attend the reception, as it had become difficult for her to be around Cassius since their last conversation. And here, she didn't even have anyone to talk to. After all, Luna had invited only her friends here, and the daughter of a mere baron was not allowed to come, so her friend Eliza was not here. But still she came here with her friend Philippe, who at once took notice of the sumptuous banquet. Because of that conversation with Cassius, she didn't feel like coming here. But as the Count's daughter, she was not at liberty to refuse the Marquise's daughter's invitation. So now she stood in front of Luna next to her friend. When she noticed that Cassius was not with her guest, the hostess asked where he was, and was very disappointed when Ebby, who knew at once that she had been waiting for him, told her that he was not feeling well and had stayed at home. During their conversation, another girl named Marianne Quilton came into the room, and hearing that they were talking about Cassia, clarified whether the boy they were talking about was the one she was thinking of. After introducing herself, the heroine hurried to introduce her friend, but the girl who had just arrived came up to Luna and laughed at the guest's partner, calling him insolent and noting that he was eating like crazy, even though he didn't look like he was starving. Deciding to change the subject, the rude girl asked the protagonist how she knew Cassius, and she admitted that he was the son of her mother's friend, which was true. But suddenly Luna joined their conversation and added that right after the wedding, the Countess moved here from the capital, where she befriended the boy's mother. Finally, Marianne turned to the heroine again, asking if the boy was still having seizures, and the impudent girl, hearing this, pounced on the poor guest with questions as to whether the patient was really having seizures. The girl, stunned by the insolence of her friends, wanted to speak, but Marianne answered for her, telling her that at the reception in honor of the Crown Prince, Cassius had a seizure, and that such a thing was not worth seeing, and when he woke up, he was foaming at the mouth. Hearing this, the heroine, who had not known of such cases before, became very alarmed. There were a lot of people in the hall, and Abby noticed that two girls were discussing something animatedly with each other, and when she got closer to them, she heard fragments of phrases, that someone was shaking and foaming at the mouth, and that it was hard to believe it. And then the heroine guessed that it was about her guest and began to guess why he didn't like receptions and how much he went through trying to hide his true countenance under a mask. It was a shame that she hadn't known about this before, and now she was beginning to feel bad for telling him earlier how much fun the receptions were, and that something interesting always happened at them, because her words must have reopened his old wound. Luna continued chatting with her friend and resented how she still wanted to be friends with this guy because of his noble background, with this rude guy. And even though her friend asked her to be careful with her words, the girl wouldn't let up. The girls chattered about how it wasn't that big of a deal that he was defective, and the main thing was that he was Duke Ulrico's son, and that even if he died, it wouldn't matter. Abby stood stunned and wondered why it pissed her off so much and how children could talk like that, what kind of nonsense they were talking about. And the worst part was that they were discussing it in front of the one who lived under the same roof with him. One of the girls came up to the heroine and asked if she had anything to add, and the girl smiled maliciously and decided not to stand silently by and teach these gossiping girls a lesson by telling them that everything they were saying was complete nonsense, and she couldn't believe it. Cassius, left alone in his room, sitting with a book in his hands, thought about the fact that he shouldn't have gotten mad at her after all. But he already knew Abby well enough that she was quick to forgive him and not let him sulk for long, even though this time they started avoiding each other and never made up. A servant who entered the boy's room, as if guessing his thoughts, asked if he had made up with the heroine, for it was known to all the servants, but the boy waved him away, asking if he could not see it for himself. For the protagonist, receptions were business, a place where aristocrats made business connections, and from a young age he socialized there only with those chosen by his parents, and did not even think that it was possible to have fun at receptions. His life always went according to a predetermined plan. But for the girl, on the contrary, everything was different. She was as if not of this world, perhaps because she lived in the province, but she was very different from other young noblewomen, and to live with her under the same roof was not bad. But her environment was not quite suitable for her. She was friends with a girl named Eliza Stim, constantly fooling around and behaving inappropriately, and there were disturbing doubts about what awaited the heroine in the future, because every aristocrat, preparing for her debut, makes friends with her equals in status. Because of her youth, she did not realize that good connections were the foundation for gaining power. And so far the heroine had no suitable friends. In that case, it was impossible for her to succeed, so Cassius reasoned. But why he even cared, he did not understand himself. Most likely, he did not stop thinking about her because of the quarrel, could not get her out of his mind, and decided to make up with her at all costs, and decided to get an invitation to a business dinner party where he would meet her. Meanwhile, the girls' bickering continued in the audience. After the heroine failed to support their conversation and condemned them, they indignantly began to demand her apology and wondered how she could do this to them while they had welcomed her family into their domain. The girl didn't want to fight with anyone, but she didn't want to give up. She didn't know what to do, and they kept demanding from her to explain their words, and how dare she, some daughter of the Count, to impertinence them. One of the girls grabbed her by the scruff of the neck, and unable to stand it, Abby replied that it was because they dared to insult a precious member of her family, and it was because her father had told her that as long as they lived together, they were a family. Eliza turned away from the girl, perplexed. How could the young Duke Yuriko be considered her family? Apparently, Count Monster decided to fool Cassius. What a trickster. After saying these words, the heroine flared up and rebuked the girl that they were talking about the boy and that being sick is bad. Is that how nobles behave? In anger, Eliza couldn't resist and threw a glass of drink at the heroine to subdue her. But the girl managed to dodge, and all the contents poured out on Cassius, who had just entered the hall and was walking towards the girls. Abby, realizing what had happened, rushed to the boy to see if he was hurt and if he was okay. She grabbed him and turned him to her, horrified to see that he was wet and stained. And at the same moment, remembering that he hated to be touched, she pulled away from him, apologizing awkwardly and handing him her handkerchief. Lady Quilton, who had poured the juice on him and was standing aside, ran up to him and began to beg his pardon, assuring him that she had not thought of pouring it on him. But he did not believe a word she said, and grudgingly called her desperate. The guy asked the other girl, Luna Vanessa, what they were talking about, and she started to ask him to forgive him, to have mercy, and that she just misspoke. But the guy reproached her that since she realized her guilt, she shouldn't have done that from the beginning. Luna thought he was nothing and a defective product, which she shared with her friend. Cassius wasn't going to let anyone get away with insulting his men, which he stated to the offending woman, for there was no one more precious than family, so Aibileen was important to him, and none of them had the right to be rude. Grabbing the heroine by the arm, he dragged her from the room, and the girl remembered that in the novel the guy had defended Eliza. She started to remember that, but then why did he end up saying her name? The girl asked in confusion what was the matter, to which the boy apologized to her that he had then gotten angry and yelled at her for no reason. Confused, she asked him not to apologize, for it was all her fault, and she had no idea that it was so serious for him. There was no telling what would have happened if the guy hadn't come then. Maybe she would have had to kneel in front of those gossipy girls. And while the heroine wasn't yet the same Aibileen from the novel that Cassius hated so much, she shyly took his hand and wondered if he had really sincerely said then that she was important to him. The guy nodded his head affirmatively as he looked into the girl's eyes and confirmed it. His smile at that moment was so beautiful that she just couldn't look away from him. After that altercation, Luna no longer bullied the heroine, and Marianne packed her bags and hurriedly returned to the capital. Perhaps the Duke was the reason for it, and fortunately, they did not snitch to her parents. It turned out that the guy was protecting the girl and no one could hurt her, and everything that happened that day was like a dream, especially his smile. The girl was angry at herself for these thoughts, but she couldn't help it, because it was as if he mesmerized her then. The girl, immersed in her fantasies, was interrupted by the loud shout of her friend, who had already called her several times, but to no avail, because she was in the clouds. A friend informed her that her brother Alan Stim was returning from summer vacation the following week. Sometime later, Eliza's gifted brother, Alan, would become Cassius's right-hand man, having demonstrated his wisdom and earned his trust by becoming his faithful secretary. The week flew by very imperceptibly, and here came the day of Alan's return. The heroine promised her friend to meet him together, so in order not to miss the right moment, she decided to temporarily live with Lizzie's family. The girl, about to leave the house, informed Cassius that she was leaving in the morning to visit a friend, as it was summer vacation at her older brother's academy, and he was returning home, so she was invited to meet him for company. The boy did not express much interest in what he said, only saying that it sounded interesting. This reaction upset the girl a little. She wondered why he was so indifferent to his future lover and friend. The girl asked him only not to be surprised, and told him that everyone thought Alan was a very versatile person, intelligent, handsome, and almost perfect in everything. He was considered the handsomest young man in their county. She also said that her friend Luna had even taken a liking to him. He was so good, though it was unfortunate that he came from the family of a mere baron. After saying this, she regretted mentioning Luna, remembering what their relationship with Cassius was like. The boy, listening attentively to the girl, suddenly asked her a question: what she thought. She was confused and did not immediately understand the question, but he repeated it and asked what she thought of Alan, whether she thought he was handsome too. This question came as a surprise to the heroine, and she didn't immediately know what to say. But after a little thought, she replied that, of course, she thought he was cute, because he was her girlfriend's brother. She thought Cassius was much prettier, though, and tried to tell him so, but he interrupted her by asking when the guy was coming, to which the girl said he was coming next week. She was a little puzzled as to why he was wondering if he had decided to go with her. So it happened, the guy still decided to go with her, which surprised even her friend on arrival. She did not expect that they would come together. At the appointed time, they all went together to the station to meet the train. The train arrived at the station, and the passengers began to get out of the cars. The girls decided to bet who would be the first to find her brother, but it was not easy to find him in such a crowd. And Lizzie, thinking that it would be easier to see everything from a height, climbed the high mountain of suitcases that stood on the platform. Since her friend was blonde, Abby was sure that her brother was also of the same hair color and began to look in the crowd for a blonde man. Cassius, who was standing by, frightened that the girl had climbed on the suitcases, ordered her to get off them immediately, as it was dangerous. At last, Alan appeared. The heroine shrieked with joy, and Lizzie threw herself into her brother's arms. Her brother hugged her and twirled her around, asking how she was doing. The heroine stood amazed at how much he had grown, despite the fact that they hadn't seen each other in months. And then he noticed the heroine and was surprised that she had also come to meet him. The girl stood astonished, for she would never have recognized him if it had not been for the color of his hair, how quickly he had grown. The brother, laughing in return and looking at his sister on the contrary, thought that she had not changed at all. And then the heroine remembered that she had forgotten to introduce her friend, who had been standing aside all this time. Turning to him, she was confused. He was standing with a very angry expression on his face, which confused everyone. Alan wasn't familiar with the guy and didn't understand the reason for the displeasure on his face. And his sister hastened to explain that she had written about this guy to her brother, that this was the same guy who had taken up residence at her girlfriend's house. The brother approached the boy with interest and extended his hand to say hello to him, and the boy, still frowning, also gave his hand in return and immediately corrected his sister, saying that it was not he who lived in the girl's house, but they lived there together, and moreover, the Count and Countess loved him as if he were a son-in-law, so they were already family. The handshake was strange. The heroine, listening to all this, came into complete bewilderment. Not understanding what he was saying, what kind of son-in-law? And yet, his expression was absolutely serious, so that everyone could believe him, and even froze in place from what he had heard. Alan exclaimed joyfully when he learned that the heroine was so popular, and that such an amazing young man wanted to be her fiancé. But the girl indignantly shook her head, refusing to listen to it. It would never happen. She started to justify herself because it was a joke. But suddenly her friend suddenly shouted that it cannot be, and Abby's husband should be only her brother. The heroine froze in place, trying to realize what she had heard, but for her, everything said was a shock. Such a turn of events she did not expect. Puzzled, the heroine approached her friend and asked her to clarify what she meant by saying that she and her brother were to become spouses. Eliza immediately ran to her brother, asking him to confirm that he was indeed marrying her girlfriend. Fortunately, at that moment there was a loud shout. Someone was calling for Alan, and when they looked around, they saw his parents walking towards them. They began to marvel at how their son had grown up and asked how his college life was. The heroine was happy that thanks to the Baron and the Baroness, the subject was hushed up. She still did not understand what had come over her friend, because it would never happen that she and Alan were together. They returned home together, drinking tea in the kitchen, and Lizzie's mother asked if she and Cassius had quarreled, for strange things had been going on, and he had been quiet lately. Perhaps they had quarreled. There was no quarrel, and the heroine decided to go talk to him. The guy was sleeping in his room because his medicine had a sleeping effect. Because of this, the patient often fell asleep after taking pills. As she walked over to the bed, she saw a crumpled sheet on the floor. Had he started throwing away the medicine again? But bending down and picking it up, she saw it was a letter to Duchess Yuriko. There were many more of the same crumpled sheets lying on the floor around, and not a single letter had been finished. This puzzled the heroine, for since he had settled with them, his family had not visited him once, but had not even bothered to write a letter. How could they be so hard on their son? Suddenly there was a rustle, and she saw that the boy was awake. He jumped up from the bed, and snatching the sheet from her hand, asked her threateningly why she was going through his things. The girl assured him that she had not done so, but he shouted loudly at her to get out of his room. The heroine left the room in a terrible confusion, apologizing once again. She did not know how to be now, and could not even look him in the eyes. Not that to make up. It was the first time he was so out of temper. Probably she had crossed the line. Suddenly the girl was called by Paul, her friend's servant. He inquired if they had had a fight, and asked the girl not to resent the lad, though he had been a little rude to her, for in fact, he had been a very sensitive child before his illness. The servant was sure that when he grew up, he would wield power that others could only dream of. Everyone was proud of him in the duchy. All the trouble began when the lad fell ill and started having seizures. The aggravation caught up with him right at the Crown Prince's birthday party, and rumors began to circulate, so they decided to send him to Monstera for a while until everything subsided, because his parents were more worried about the rumors than about their son's health.